Which one do you want, 500 horsepower or 500 horsepower? I promise you there's a difference, as you're gonna see this time on Engine Masters. We've done a number of engine-to-engine head-to-head comparisons on Engine Masters, but each time we've sort of built the engine similarly. When you do same displacement, same camshaft, cylinder heads that flow about the same carburetor, same intake, same headers, they pretty much make the same power curve. This time we're doing something a little bit different. We have two engines that are wildly different from each other, but they both make 500 horsepower. What could possibly be different about the rest of these engines? Well, virtually everything mechanically and a lot about the power curve. So let me tell you about what we're gonna do. We have a small block Chevy that measures 372 cubic inches, and we have a big block Chevy at 454 cubic inches. Now, let me tell you from top to bottom what makes these similar and what makes them different. Obviously, they're both Chevrolets, but they're two completely different engine families that share very, very little. Up top, we both have Holley carburetors, a 750 on the small block and 850 on the big block. The intake manifolds are the same manufacturer and design. They're both Performer RPM air gaps, this one on the small block, and of course the same thing on the big block. Now's when things really start to diverge. In the cylinder head department over on the big block, we've got a GM Performance Parts 290cc oval port, which would be considered a very average cylinder head for the displacement. It's not super trick. But over here on the small block, we've got the Airflow Research 195s, which would be considered an above average cylinder head for this small block. Looking at the compression ratio on both of these, the small block is tickling the underside of 11:1. It's 10.8 to 10.9 to 1 compression. On the other end of the spectrum, the big block is about 8.5 to 1. This will probably run on 87 octane, though we'll run them here on 91. Looking at the bottom end, the small block is sort of an unusual combination of bore and stroke. It's 372 cubic inches. It's a 4 1/8 inch bore and a 3.48 inch stroke. Putting it in production terms, it's like using a Chevy 350 crankshaft in a Chevy 400 block. It's a Dart aftermarket block, whereas over here on the 454, we're talking about a stock block, stock bore and stroke. 4 1/4 on the bore and 4 inches on the stroke. The camshaft in both of these is wildly different. On the small block, we have a hydraulic roller cam. The duration at 50 is 242 and 248. It's a Comp Cams off-the-shelf unit. There's also a Comp Cams cam in the big block, but it's a flat tappet, meaning much cheaper, much lower performance typically, and the duration at 50 is 230, 236, so it's a whole lot smaller. So what you're looking at in the small block is a fairly advanced street strip engine, some really good parts in it, and this particular engine has 1,000,000 laps at Westech. They've used it for probably 10,000 dyno pulls and it's never been rebuilt. That Dart short block is really good. Over here with the big block, it is a much more average engine. It's much lower buck, lower compression, less camshaft, no trick displacement. It's just off the shelf 454. So the question is, if both of these make 500 horsepower, which one would you choose? We're gonna look at that in depth in this episode. And we're gonna do it with two simple dyno pulls. First, we're gonna run the small block, then we're gonna run the big block, and then we're gonna have a conversation with the two Steves with us all shooting out why you would choose the small block versus why you would choose the big block. Okay, Steve, why don't we save time? We won't bother running the engine. You can just draw the curves from memory. I figure you've seen it so many times.
2,000 to 3,000 times.
Yeah. Yeah, that engine's like an anvil, man.
No, it absolutely has been incredible. I mean, it's seen so many different tests, different style tests, camshafts and intake manifolds and cylinder heads and headers and collector. More stuff than I can remember.
And never been freshened up.
The oil's been changed, it's been maintained well, and that's truly about it. The pan's never been off of it since the day it was built, what, 12 years ago?
Yeah, well, Dulcich and I can break it just by being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, don't worry, Steve. You'll be going through it.
So I guess we just run this thing, tear it down, run the other one, so there's nothing to do but to do it.
Then I guess we need to do it.
Go ahead.
Okay.
quite 500 horsepower coming up.
Yeah, almost 500 horsepower.
Almost. There you go, kind of the normal power this engine makes with this intake manifold. Honestly, if we had a single plane on it, it bumps it up to 510.
Yeah.
Something like that. But right now we've got 497 horsepower, 3 shy of a magazine cover blurb.
That's right.
And then we've also got 463.9 pound-feet of torque.
I could go lap it once or twice and get the oil hot, and I'll bet it'll make 500.
Yeah, we can fool around a little bit, but I think that's not really going to be the point.
No.
The point is going to be the gross change in the curve that we'll see between these two 500 horsepower engines or 497 horsepower
Yes.
engines.
What if they're the same?
Then that would be the oddest thing I ever saw.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would say it's very unlikely. You know.
Yeah.
If our big block makes 463 pound-feet of torque, I'm going to go throw it in the dumpster.
Okay.
Because it's obviously
Yeah.
broken.
Yeah, sometimes we do these tests and we're taking a risk because we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. This time, I'm pretty sure we've got a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let's go prove it. We got to unhang the small block and we're going to roll in our 454 big block. You know what, I'm thinking this might be the first time that we've ever changed a complete engine for an A/B test.
And we think they're both supposed to make 500.
They should. Actually, one thing I wanted to point out to the audience about what we're doing here is that, yeah, we're using Chevy engines again, but what you're about to see is a demonstration that really applies to anything. So you can take exactly what we're doing here and you can apply it to Chevy, Ford, Mopar, big and small LS engines, four bangers, anything. What they're doing here is actually a really good tech tip, which is draining the water out of the block. Most engines, maybe even all, have drain plugs that go into the water jackets on both sides of the V. You actually have to drain both sides because they don't share side to side, except for across the water pump and across the thermostat housing. And it's just way better to store an engine that way so you don't rot the inside of the coolant passages and so you don't spill like water and coolant everywhere. Test number 2, the 454 big block. Looks like that did what I was hoping it was gonna do.
Pretty close.
Let's see. And there's our curve. Look at that.
That's
the
a nice curve.
power curve. This is really similar to what we saw with our small block as far as peak horsepower, 498.7 at 5,800 RPM. And then the torque is 544.3 at 4,000 RPM, a wee bit different than the small block, just a little
bit, yeah.
Yeah, so let's look at the overlays. Two engines, pretty much 500 horsepower each, but what are the curves gonna look like? Yowza.
Whoa.
Black lines, big block. Red lines, small block. The only similarity here is peak horsepower. Otherwise, completely different characteristics on these engines, which is what I want to talk about. I actually have a scoring sheet.
Oh, really? I'm ready.
I do. What are your initial reactions?
Small block, more RPM, which I like.
You know where I'm at.
Big block
It's
Chevy.
a big block.
This much more
you
torque.
Can't make that up with RPM.
This is just absolutely comically more torque than the small block.
It's 100 pound-feet.
Yeah. No, it's completely dumb.
Yeah.
And so what's going to play into my discussion from this point on is the fact that both of these things you can go to a cruise night and go, oh, yeah, I got 500 horsepower. But it's going to behave completely differently, not only because of the power differences, but also because the RPM characteristics of each engine. I think we can definitely score for overall power. The big block wins, right?
Absolutely.
You like the small block because of RPM. We like the big block because of big, meaty power. Next, by engine builder standards, which one of these is a better combination? So this is where I want to start looking at specific output. Torque per cubic inch, horsepower per cubic inch. Obviously, the small block wins horsepower per cubic inch because they make the same power and it's a smaller engine. How about torque per cubic inch?
I'll go with
Calculated,
small
I think they're
block.
pretty close.
No way.
Nah, small block's
No
got-
way.
Small block's
No.
got this.
So 544 pound-feet
Divided by
big block
454.
divided by 454 is 1.198.
Okay,
The small block, what's the peak torque on it?
463.
463.7. So we will go 463.7 divided by 372 cubic inches, 1.246.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing there is that the big block is low compression.
Right.
Probably the head is not as good per the displacement as the small block is.
Well, part of that, though, for me, says that it's going to last longer. It doesn't have as much compression. It doesn't
I'm getting
have the
there.
engine speed.
I'm talking by engine builder standards. Which one would you look at and go, yeah, that thing's pretty sweet, you did a good job? I would say the small block. The big block is not as impressive for what it is.
No, it's not as impressive, except for how
Although-
much power it makes.
I guess the problem with that, though, is like, what's your goal?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, these engines are basically two different goals. So,
Right.
So what's your vote, big block or small block?
Well, mine's still big block.
Unquestionably, the small block, it's got way
Yeah.
better specific output.
I say small block also, so it's gonna win that. All right, Steve, I'm gonna let you judge this one. What's the better magazine blurb?
Oh, it's small block again.
So the small
It's
block
just hands
wins.
down, it's getting every
the cover blurb.
category.
500 horsepower small block, way
Yeah.
better than 500 horsepower big block.
Well, wouldn't you agree?
Price. This is a tough one. So I price some things out. A big block Edelbrock RPM intake manifold is way more expensive than a small block.
Okay.
Even the Edelbrock oval port heads, I know these are GM, but I priced the Edelbrock oval port, which is similar.
Right.
They're basically $2,000 a set, and it's a couple $100 cheaper for the Airflow Research 195s that are on the small
Right.
block. The Dart short block that's on the small blocks, $5,500 or something in that neighborhood. Whereas I would argue this, you could do this same power package on the big block with a junkyard short block.
Yeah, that's for a $500 short block and a freshen up.
Exactly. So overall price, I'm gonna throw it to the big block. What's your opinion?
Oh, yeah, if you're slumming it, I mean, it's your only alternative. You can't afford that small block.
Right.
You'd have to get the big block.
So we all agree that the big block
Yeah.
wins on price? Okay, here's an interesting one. Looking at these two power curves, what is the difference in performance in the car? And this comes down to a lot, because the question is, if you have 500 horsepower, does it run the same ET in the quarter mile if you've got the rest of the car tuned to the torque curve? Like, for example, you would have a 373 gear to run 115 miles an hour with this big block. You'd have a 489 gear to run the same mile an hour with the small block. So which one's quicker at that point?
My sense is the big block's still going to be faster. There's way too much torque to get the mass moving. I mean, unless you can run your car in a 200 RPM range, you have to take into account the rest of the curve. And the big block's huge in the rest of the curve.
And you can't gear the big block lower or it will run out of RPM, because
Yeah.
as we see right here where it takes a nosedive, it's done at 6,000.
So you have an extra 1,000 plus RPM with the small block. You can gear it a lot lower, and you're going to get most of that extra torque back at the rear wheels in first gear.
Ain't happening. Anytime you change gears, it's losing 1,500 RPM, whether it's a power glide or you've got to make a gear change and it's going to drop in RPM.
Oh,
If
shifting.
you run it 700 over, it falls 700 under. So you've got this portion of the curve. The big block always falls back into the meat of it. It's got way more power at the gear change, and it's going to pull in the next gear better.
I thought you meant rear end gear change. You're talking about
No,
transmission
I'm talking about
gear
transmission
change.
gear
I
change.
meant rear end. I was talking about rear end.
Oh, I
gears,
understand,
so-
but I'm just saying if you're drag racing it, you've got to change gears. You don't have a one-speed in your car.
And you change gears more often with a deeper gear.
Yeah.
It's like instead of a power glide, you might end up needing a 4-speed or a turbo 400 or
Yeah.
whatever.
But even if they both had power glides in them, this has more meat at the gear change.
I would say that's undeterminable. I mean, we'll
Well,
probably
we're
make
bench racing
it a tie, because I would say small block in a light car with a manual transmission and a really deep gear. You'd have to really work pretty hard to beat it with that lazy big block.
If the two vehicles have the same weight, the big block is going to cream the small block every time. If the big block car is heavier, there's a good chance it's still going to cream the small block.
Yeah, let's
'cause of the
just
torque
say instead of
difference.
revving it or shifting it past peak power, just shift it at peak power.
Right.
And it loses 1,500 RPM. What happens down here?
It
Which
falls
one
into
has
the-
more power down here?
Yeah.
Because you have to take that into account too. It's
Area under the
average
curve.
power. It's not just a peak number.
Yeah, well, I agree to an extent.
Okay, so you and I are gonna say that the big block actually has better overall performance in drag racing. How about your average drive around street car or truck?
Well,
Big block.
If you're looking at a tugboat engine or a locomotive engine
Right.
or something like that, then all of that torque is important. The same thing with the heavy street car. You know, I'd have to say that torque has an advantage in that kind of
Yep,
environment for sure.
big block.
Yeah.
Heavy car, boat, it just fits
Right.
way more applications.
High rear end gear.
Yeah.
It's more drivable. It has a smaller cam. The big block can take a lower stall speed converter, higher rear end gear, heavier car. It'll idle smoother. Everything about drivability and low end is better with the big block. Off camera 3 minutes ago, he was trying to figure out how to make his Suburban fast. Go ahead and throw that small block in there, Steve.
Oh, no, I wouldn't. Well, that's a big, heavy boat. I need torque.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, no question.
I'm gonna hand you this one. Which engine wins for weight?
For weight, oh, small block.
Small block. How about fitting in the car? Small block.
Oh, wow, categories are favoring the small block now.
How about mileage?
Ooh.
I bet these both get the same gas
Yeah.
mileage in truth. So overall, our win is gonna have to go to the big block.
I don't see how it can't. I mean, you just look at this.
Yeah.
And that's the whole story.
Yep.
Whether it's in a boat, driving down the street, I mean, for me, it's just a big block.
But Steve, I mean, if you really want to hold to that logic, then what you're saying is always just build the biggest engine that you can. The most
What
cubic
other
inch is
logic
always
have I
the
ever
best.
gone by?
Right. There's no replacement for.
Displacement.
There you go.
Okay, guys.
But also, I think this is a really interesting comparison because magazine cover blurb would say 500 horsepower in both cases, but the big block, cheaper to build, tamer to drive around, does way better burnouts, it's less high strung, it's gonna be more reliable, you know?
That big block's got a 230 at 50 camshaft. I think it's
Yeah.
a flat tappet.
Right.
It's a $100 camshaft.
Right. Yeah, it's dinky. It has more manifold vacuum, I presume. You know, there's
sure it
With
does.
less cam and 100 cubic or 80 cubic inches, probably.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all we really proved here is that more displacement makes more torque, and you can build a tamer engine that's easier to drive and make more power.
All right, you guys got me on this one. That's probably a pretty good combination. The big block 454.
Yep, I think so.
It's my choice.
So I guess this is a pretty simple point, but our point is made. You can make the same horsepower with two different engines and come up with a completely different torque curve. Now I'm gonna throw you for a curve, which is, I would also like to look at the power curve of your favorite engine that we've ever done on the show, which is the Motorhome 440 with the stock heads and the turbo.
No, my engine's over there.
No.
It's the all aluminum big block. That's my favorite engine.
No, I want to see the 500 horsepower bone stock 440. We wanted to have a cam intake, stock manifolds, turbo. I think it made right around 500 horsepower. Let's see what happens then. Okay, so now here's a 514 horsepower engine, 14 up, 16 up from what we're looking at with the other two engines, but it's making it with boost. Junk cylinder heads, a smoking garbage short block, garbage cylinder heads, a 50-year-old intake manifold design.
Right.
Nearly.
And factory log manifolds.
Factory log manifolds and a turbo. And I think at this point we were making about 9 pounds.
Yeah.
And so we made 644 pound-feet of torque and 514 horsepower. As compared to the big block that we just tested, you can see once again, horsepower up here is about the same, but the torque jumps up way big, even compared to the big block.
Knowing he loves Mopars, we have to ask, so now which one do you like?
Oh, the Turbo 440.
Of course.
What are you talking about, Steve-O? Look at the torque.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there we've given you 3 different combinations to look at. If you want 500 horsepower, that's not your only question. You want to look at what you're doing for the torque curve. You also want to look at price, reliability, how big the engine is in the car, whether you want to fabricate turbo stuff. It's all up to you, and now you know what the difference is in the overall power curve for 3 engines that make about the same horsepower.
Yeah,
Yep.
still want the big block Chevy.
Still want the big block Chevy, and you'll see more of those, I guarantee it, on future episodes of Engine Masters. Steve just wants more big blocks. That's all that really comes down to. And I guarantee there will be more of those on future episodes of Engine Masters. Come on, Brule, get in on the action. Ready for this? Watch, we can make him do it.
Do I go that way?
No, you have to go this way.
Okay.
It's on future episodes of Engine Masters. See, he's trainable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Woohoo!